Hi, so in this video we're going to look at what happens if you pursue policies to reduce the fiscal deficit or deal with the national debt. So if we're going to impose fiscal austerity to reduce the fiscal deficit, that could be cuts in government expenditure and or increases in taxes to obtain more tax revenue. What will be the effects of this? Well, first of all, you could cut the welfare state, you could cut benefits, and this would tend to increase income inequality, unless the top has been pushed down by the recession, if you're in a recession. Also, you could cut infrastructure spending. Governments are often tempted not to cut current expenditure, but to cut capital expenditure. And this will tend to, of course, reduce potential future economic growth. If you're cutting electrification of train lines, or an improvement in the road network, etc., or improvement in communications. It's likely to cause a fall in GDP. If you're already in a recession, it could worsen the recession. So in the case of Britain in 2010, we'd come out of a recession, we were recovering pretty well, and in 2010 a fiscal austerity was imposed, and it's normally caused a further recession. Certainly we weren't far off a further recession. So it's likely to reduce demand in the economy and therefore worsen a recession if you're already in a recession. And indeed, for every pound cut in government expenditure, or indeed tax rise, the budget deficit will be cut by less than £1, because as GDP is falling, aggregate demand will be falling, the growth in income will be falling, and therefore you're basically having a negative multiplier effect. And this means that you have to cut even more than a pound to actually get your pound cut in the budget deficit. Now on the other side, pro-market, free market economists, once a Keynesian, would argue that you get efficiency savings, which you can cut waste out in the public sector, and you can cut jobs in the public sector and create jobs in the private sector. And millions of jobs were created in the private sector in the UK after 2010, although some of these jobs, of course, are on zero-hour contracts. And this idea of efficiency savings and removing waste from the public sector is based on the principle of crowding out, which is explained in another video. And a good example in Britain might be that the police service has certainly been cut by around about 50% since 2010 to 2018 in the UK. But crime levels have actually fallen over that period. Whether that would have occurred in any, or they might have occurred more, of course, that's a counterfactual. But people will claim that just because you cut public services in terms of spending doesn't mean to say that it affects the quality, because it's removing perhaps inefficiency, that unknown factor of waste. Now, if you've got a national debt, how are you going to cut the national debt? And there are three main ways of cutting the national debt. One, of course, is to have a fiscal surplus, so that tax revenue will be greater than government expenditure, and that will reduce the national debt. But if you're talking about the national debt as a proportion of GDP, okay, if GDP is growing faster than your budget deficit, okay, then you're actually going to reduce your national debt as a proportion of GDP. In other words, also if we look at it this way, that if government expenditure is the same as taxation, as the economy grows, the national debt will gradually get less as a proportion of GDP. So if the national debt is, say, 100 billion, and your economy is 1,000 billion, as it grows towards, say, 1,200 billion, then that 100 billion will become less as a percentage, okay, of the total output of the economy. Now, the other thing, of course, is inflation. So if you have inflation, that will reduce the real value of the national debt. Of course, the problem with that is it will affect savers. So people who are saving through government bonds may well be suffering, okay, in real terms. but as a debtor, the government will be benefiting. Now, in the 2008 financial crisis, it resulted in huge debts, fiscal deficits for many countries. And the case of Greece, Spain and Portugal, quite interesting because they had very large structural deficits. That's a deficit where when you have a boom, you'll still have that deficit. It might be less, but you won't pay it off through automatic stabilisers. If you see the video on automatic stabilisers, that might help. So Greece, Spain and Portugal, because they've got a large structural deficit, they therefore did require some form of fiscal austerity. And of course the Troika got involved, the IMF, the EU and the European Central Bank, to lead a bailout. And so quite severe fiscal austerity was imposed in these countries. And whether it needs to be that severe is a big question, of course. Now, if we come to the case of the USA and the UK in particular, the USA and France use automatic stabilisers because as the economy grew again, there'll be more tax revenue and the fiscal deficit, the budget deficit, would reduce. And in the UK, this was the case from 2007 and 8 or 2010. The government pursued mildly Keynesian expansionary policies. However, in the case of the UK after 2010, fiscal austerity was imposed. VAT, for example, was increased to 20%. Cuts were made in the public expenditure. And this, of course, reduced, as I said earlier, resulted in slower growth. And therefore, when you've got slower growth, you're going to get lower tax revenues from corporation tax on profits, from income tax on incomes, as incomes aren't increasing so quickly, and also from expenditure taxes, such as VAT, as expenditure is increasing less quickly if you're slowing economic growth. So you're going to get less tax revenue, and therefore, when you actually look at government expenditure as a percentage of GDP, it didn't fall. And indeed, by 2015, the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP of the UK and the USA was about the same. Having the USA pursued a somewhat Keynesian policy, and the UK pursuing a more free market fiscal austerity policy, ended up really in the same place, but the cost for the UK is quite significant in terms of lower growth, lower standard of living, and also cuts in public services. Some economists argue that this, of course, was a factor behind the Brexit vote in 2016. Anyhow, these are the key points about how you reduce the fiscal deficit and deal with the national debt. Thank you for watching.